Coming up on Dialogue Weekend, the 4th International Import Expo opens in Shanghai. What new opportunities can we expect from this year's expo? U.S. consumer costs, including food and energy, continue to climb. How serious is the persistent inflation, and how will the U.S. government deal with it? And this week's newsmaker, now on Dialogue Weekend.
Hey, welcome to this edition of Dialogue Weekend. I'm Li Qiuyuan. The world's biggest import fair, the 4th China International Import Expo, opened in Shanghai. Nearly 3,000 exhibitors have come from 127 countries and regions around the world to showcase their products and services at the expo. Now, Chinese President Xi Jinping delivered a keynote speech on Thursday detailing measures China has taken since the last expo to open its doors to trade and further initiatives to open up. Amid global supply chain challenges, what are some of these initiatives? And what's so special about this year's expo, and how will it help foster global growth? To find out more about this, I'm now joined by Professor Zhang Gong at the University of International Business and Economics, and Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney, Professor of Politics at East China Normal University, and also Mr. David Mahone, Executive Chairman of Mahone China Investment Management. Great to see you all. So, at this opening ceremony, the president delivered a speech saying that China's opening measures unveiled at the 3rd Expo last year have basically been implemented. Let me start with you, Professor Gong. What do you make of the progress being made so far? What do you make of the determination of China to opening up and improving global trade?
The messages in President Xi's speech are not surprising at all. He has been emphasizing the importance of continuing to open up Chinese economy to investment, for trade. And I think my biggest takeaway from that speech is that he explicitly said that China is going to strive for a balanced trade. I think this is a very important. What it means is that exports and imports have to be more or less the same. And we know that for a long time, China has always been enjoying a quite sizable trade surplus, especially in trade of goods. Last year it was, if I remember this correctly, it's over $500 billion. I mean, that's about $500 billion of trade surplus, and that's a very significant number. And I think President Xi's mentioning of developing in the direction of overall balanced trade is a very strong message. What it means is that it's going to be increasing imports from the rest of the world into China, and this show itself is a big testimony to that. And I think it bodes very well for a lot of people around the world that the world's largest consumer market is going to import a lot of things from you.
And other big headlines today is that China has also applied to join the Digital Economic Partnership Agreement, right? Mr. Mahone, let me bring you into this. China also promised to shorten the negative list for market access. What do these moves mean for investors? What are some of the changes we're likely to see in the immediate future?
I think these are very important moves for China because of its increased isolation in other areas where, particularly with the United States, curtailing China around technology. So any of these moves are very important counterpoints. China needs to make sure that it has the capacity to develop its own indigenous technology, particularly in computer chips. But I think China's always tried to keep as involved in a balanced way with these multilateral global organizations. You know, its demeanor in the United Nations, WHO, is actually a lot better than many of the so-called developed countries. So it's a good initiative because the rest of the world is shrinking to some extent, and many Western countries are closing against each other and certainly developing markets as part of China's economy is. So these are very important initiatives.
Yeah, the president also defended the WTO and also multilateralism. You know, this year also marks the 20th anniversary of China entering the WTO. And the president pledged that China will firmly safeguard what he called true multilateralism. What do you make of this comment, Professor Mahoney? What does he mean by true multilateralism, and how important is it that at a time he's defending the WTO at a time when the organization has been criticized being as obsolete, as outdated?
Well, we know that during the last administration in this country, the Trump administration, there were very transparent efforts to abandon multilateralism. quit the World Health Organization, quit the Paris Agreement, and to cast doubt on the WTO and other international organizations. And so, this was sort of a wholesale undercutting of this. But then, with Biden, what we've seen is this re-embrace of multilateralism, but it's not really, if we're being honest, a true multilateralism. It's sort of a working through and around organizations, but in a way that's trying to reestablish U.S. hegemony over them. So it's kind of using the multilateral system as to facilitate American unilateralism. And I think that what this displays is the continuation of a logic that was already deeply rooted in Washington before Trump, during Trump, and still this zero-sum hegemony that there needs to be one global power, one peacekeeper, one global policeman. And so this is, problematic for China and other countries that are tired of this type of constraint. And furthermore, it's difficult for a world that's trying to recover from COVID, that has increasing peacekeeping concerns. And above all, as we saw this past weekend, COP26 and just the general failure we've seen on a global level to get emissions under control. And instead, we're still seeing them increase well beyond what was hoped, as well as an expanding hole in the ozone layer down in the Antarctic. So these are all problems.
Right, and one of the buzzwords at this year's Expo, Mr. Mahone, is low carbon. What are some of the opportunities you are seeing as this green push for low carbon development or carbon neutrality is growing?
There are many opportunities. I don't particularly like carbon credits and carbon trading. It's a bit like buying indulgences in the Middle Ages. You get dispensation to do something bad. What I like about China's initiatives have been that they closed a number of coal mines. Partly that was for worker safety, but also it was an attempt to manage and make its own burning of fossil fuels more efficient. They went too far, and so have had some I would say minor power outages. In Western media, these are being reported as some kind of economic catastrophe, which they're not. But it shows that the commitment to fewer emissions, definitely in China's power sector, is true. So I think China's moving into a very good systematic way of trying to control this within its economy. In terms of investment opportunities, there always exists renewables, there are always alternatives. And we have to remember that it was China that made mass solar panels economic. And certainly wind power first became economic in China because of the scale at which the wind farms were constructed. So China's already initiated a lot. There's a lot more to be done. But of course, we're up against the incumbent lobbies of fossil fuel companies. And it's interesting that China, that was thought to be the least likely to embrace these moves because of the economic cost, is doing so. So in this sense, I think China is leading the world.
Another interesting trend we're seeing at this year's Expo is the establishment of the section dedicated to artwork, right? Mr. Mahone, again, now we've seen works by Chinese artist Zhang Daqian, French artist Claude Monet being featured at the Expo, and we understand that the art market sales globally reached over $50 billion in the year 2020, and sales from within China has ranked second highest in the world. I mean, how big of a role do you think the Shanghai's free trade zone could play in accelerating trade in artworks?
Oh, a very big role. I mean, it's a very important part of China's relationship with the world and different countries' relationship with China. We underestimate the power of culture, whether it's in its commercial forms, trading artworks, or the exhibitions that you identified. These are crucial links for us to understand each other. I would hope that increasingly Chinese artworks are canvassed, they are taken on tour in the same way as we can enjoy looking at Claude Monet today in Shanghai. So it's a very important part of the interchange globally that is often forgotten. The focus is on the conflicts diplomatically, the focus is always on hardcore commercial activity. But I'm looking forward to a time when Western art troupes, whether they're opera companies or ballet companies, can start traveling through China again as they did pre-COVID. And the same in terms of China exporting its culture to the world.
Professor Gone, what do you make of this? Is this a new focus we are seeing, or not so much? I mean, how will exchanges of culture and art help promote global trade and cooperation?
Absolutely. You know, as China's consumers get better off, well off, I mean, their preference and their taste would also change. I would say, you know, upgrade. You know, in the old days, we're talking about food, we're talking about fashion, we're talking about cars and all that kind of things. But I think as you know, the society's living standards have been keep rising, you know, the future of consumer taste will be pointing out to these things, as you said. You know, these are cultural goods, especially I think imported from overseas. I don't think that the Chinese consumers have been too much exposed to artwork overseas at this point, other than maybe, you know, really rich billionaires have bought a piece here and there. But I think this kind of a demand can indeed percolate down to the middle class as well. I think the consumers in China do have the purchasing power to buy these things. So, you know, I think this is a very big market. It has a lot of future growth as we move forward. And so I think, you know, this is one big piece of the things that can be imported into China in the future.
And Professor Mahoney, we have noticed that, you know, more than 3,000 exhibitors from 127 countries and regions are participating at this year's expo, but none of the companies are from India. How are you looking at this? Does it reflect the current state in China-India relations, perhaps?
You know, the frictions and the fact that recent efforts to sort of resolve some of the border issues were not successful. Now we're moving into the winter efforts where that situation tends to, you know, literally freeze up, and we wait until spring before it becomes an issue again. But you know, it's important to note that bilateral trade between China and India is up 50% in the first 3 quarters of 2021. And with respect to participation in CIIE, you know, India has always had a small presence. COVID certainly doesn't, the continuing problems with COVID certainly doesn't help. But I think it's also the case that what we've seen from India, at least in terms of some of the things that they've said in their diplomatic corps, is that they'd really like to see an expansion of opportunities for Indian pharmaceuticals and technology in China. And those openings just don't exist right now. So, you know, until they do, we shouldn't expect, I think, much, as well as the frictions and COVID. So, but that said, yeah, trade is up, and I think that that should be the focus.
All right. Let's now take a look at our second story of the day. According to the U.S. Commerce Department, U.S. inflation has risen to its fastest pace in more than 30 years, coming in at 4.4% in September, running well above the Fed's 2% goal. Now, while prices have been rising, the Federal Reserve insists the high current rate is expected to be transitory. So what caused this fast rise, and to what extent will it influence the global economy? For this part, I'm now joined by Anthony Chen, former J.P. Morgan Chase chief economist, together with Professor John Gone and Professor Joseph Mahoney. Good to see you there, Mr. Chen. Let me start with you this time. You know, inflation in the United States has been rising since November 2020, and there are warnings that things could get out of control. The U.S. economy could overheat. To you, what would be some of the risks if things don't get under control?
Well, I think that the risks are that people will fall behind on their purchasing power. That's a real serious issue. But the reality is that the economy in the United States is slowing. And as the economy slows, we will see those inflationary pressures ease a bit. Already we've heard from the Federal Reserve that they're going to be tapering. So all these factors should help. And then one final and most important issue is, remember that the Federal Reserve moved towards a flexible average inflation targeting, which means that they look at inflation over a longer period of time. James Bullard, the president of the St. Louis Fed, said a window of about 5 years looking backwards is pretty reasonable. And as I do the computations, when you look at inflation over the last 5 years, it's still averaging below 2%.
Professor Gone, you know, the Fed has suggested that this round of inflation is only transitory. They say they will stay patient, wait for more growth, job growth, and then before, you know, that they raise interest rates. But how much of this is really transitory? How much is this is here to stay? Is this some kind of structural problem in the U.S. landscape we're going to see in the future?
Well, by transitory, what he really means is that this inflation, in his view, is caused by the hiccup in the supply chain. In other words, because of the clog going on right now in Long Beach and Los Angeles, the containers are not being unloaded, stuffs are not getting onto the shelves as box retail stores, and then as a result, companies are jacking up prices. So this is really, according to their view, is caused by the supplier shortage in the short run. So that's what it means by transitory. You know, I think there's some truth in that certainly, but at a very fundamental level, there's still a shadow lingering as a result of rounds and rounds of quantitative easing, and also the these checks being sent out for the pandemic checks helping people. And a lot of American households been receiving thousands of dollars of these paychecks, these welfare checks essentially, and you have to ask where these checks are coming from. Well, these checks are being printed, so will it eventually transform into inflationary pressure? I think at some point it will. So I think this is really the trade-off here, and whether this the price run-ups are being caused by the supply chain hiccups or fundamentally by the welfare policies. And I think you know, there's the jury still out there. I think, but at least in the short run, I think the Fed is believing that it's more of the former as opposed to the latter. So we just have to wait and see whether, you know, this inflationary pressure is going to be over the long run. I think we're not going to go back to the pre-pandemic price anyway. I mean, look at the oil prices, look at the other commodity prices. They've all gone up a lot. Even if the short run transitory hiccup in the supply chain is going to be resolved very quickly, I think there's still going to be, you know, pressure on the high price level. So I don't think that the price is going to come down anytime soon. The Americans are already, you know, have to pay for high prices. They have been paying high prices, and also partly to the tariffs as well. You know, there's a news coming out that Jake Sullivan is talking about even increasing tariffs. I think that's just nuts. You know, American households are already paying high price, and he's talking about paying tariffs, imposing tariffs again. Ultimately, they have to be paid by American households. So just going to add things even worse.
Yeah, American households, they are paying high prices. We're seeing reports where price hikes are seen in basic food items, meat, eggs, clothes, diapers, cars. Professor Mahoney, you are joining us from Memphis. You live in the States. How do you feel about things? How are people's lives being affected by all of this?
Well, you know, the comments that were just made are on point. The one that I'll add two points before I answer your question directly. The first is we have to recall that last year the Fed increased the money supply by 20%. This was also a significant contributor, and that as was noted, the tariffs and which were passing on cost. But you know, the thing is, inflation is a type of regressive tax, one that affects the middle class and especially the working class. And I think that's what we're seeing with people who are paying higher cost for fuel. I mean, I see this when I go to the gas pump several times a week. But also when we go to the shops, we're facing two problems. One, shortage of goods, a lot of empty shelves, and higher prices in the supermarket. And you know, although we have these subsidies coming from the U.S. government right now, of course, as was noted, they are being given to us in the form of national debt. And I think eventually all of this is going to come due. But in the meantime, it's really the working class and the middle class that are paying for it. and we'll pay for it again in the future as well.
Yeah, the lower income families might be affected the worst, not so much for the top 1%. The Fed announced on Wednesday that it will begin to pull back its $120 billion monthly bond buying program later this month. Mr. Chan, now the central bank is set to reduce its bond purchases as well by $15 billion per month. Will this be enough now? What's next to come?
I don't think it's enough, but it certainly is a step in the right direction. As you just heard, the Federal Reserve increased the money supply. Right now, when you look at the money supply relative to nominal GDP, it's about 90% of nominal GDP. It was about 50% during the global financial crisis. So clearly there's been a lot of stimulus that's taken place, and the shortages are not related or focused solely on getting goods to the port and things like that. We also have a shortage of workers out there, and people are scratching their heads, and some people are even accusing the workers of not wanting to work because they're receiving these checks. Well, first of all, the checks have ended. And the second thing is that the Census Bureau has estimated that there are 3.7 million people in the United States that are either not going to work because they either have COVID or COVID-related symptoms, or taking care of somebody that has COVID-19. And then you have another 2.5 million people that are not going to work because they're afraid of catching COVID. Now, the good news is that with all the medical achievements that we've made, I think that over the next 6 to 12 months, these people will be feeling better. And second, the concern about COVID will be going away. So again, this is another inflationary issue that we have to worry about, namely the shortage of labor. I think that will ease also. So that's another reason why I think things get better moving forward. And the Federal Reserve yesterday or this week reiterated and made very clear that although they're going to cut the bond purchase by $15 billion, and that means that they'll finish their job by June of 2022, they can accelerate that if they feel inflationary pressures are accelerating or at least not improving. So there is flexibility to get the job done.
And the hashtag #EmptyShelvesJoe is now trending on Twitter as American social media users complain about the skyrocketing prices and also empty shelves before Christmas. It's going to be holiday season soon, right? And the White House Chief of Staff tweeted recently that supply chain issues were, quote, high-class problems. Professor Mahoney, what does he mean by high-class problems? If this is high-class problem, what are low-class problems?
Well, you know, he was retweeting something from a Harvard professor who was formerly an advisor in the Obama administration, and it's really difficult to know what Klein really meant by that. He has a reputation for, kind of shooting off from the mouth in Twitter more than he should, but it was easily portrayed by the right in this country as being elitist and out of touch. But I think Klein's intent here was to shift responsibility to Trump policies for a lot of the inflation that we're feeling now, and to a large extent this is valid in so much as it was Trump's catastrophic failure in governance to deal with COVID and the incredible actions that we needed to see then from the Fed and other subsidies to along with the decoupling and the tariffs. All these things have had tremendous impacts on inflation. But the fact of the matter is the Biden administration has not done much to actually reverse this, and I don't think we're going to see much that it can do as a matter of fiscal policy, and so we're going to be left with having to wait to see what sort of rabbit the Fed can pull out of the hat. Yeah. But in the meantime, we know that Biden is struggling. He hasn't gotten his infrastructure bill, and his poll numbers are plummeting, and the Dems just lost an important bellwether election in Virginia. So
yeah, there are also ripple effects that can be felt globally, right? The U.S. loose monetary policy has already brought rising commodity prices, disrupting other economies in the world. We're going to leave it there for now for this part. Let's now have a look at this week's Newsmaker. Well, Tesla Tesla founder Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, posted an 1,800-year-old Chinese poem on Twitter this week without any clear references as to what it was about, which has spurred confusion on social media, especially in China. So what's the poem and what is Mr. Musk trying to say here? For this part, I'm joined by Professor Zhang Gong, Professor Joseph Gregory Mahoney, and Mr. Anthony Chan. Let me start with you, Professor, because I know you have quite an interpretation of this post by Elon Musk. The 7 steps verse is a famous poem in Chinese history, right? Essentially, every kid in China know this poem. They've been taught in elementary school. What do you think that he meant by this poem?
Well, firstly, let me say a few words about that poem. The poem essentially says that, the emperor has 2 sons. Sort of one son is actually going to take on the second one. The second one basically says that, you use the example of beanstalks, being burning to boil the beans. And he said that they're coming from the same root. Why doing that, right? So essentially, he's asking this question. The author of the poem is asking this question because we're all about the same. We shouldn't be at each other, going after each other. I think what Elon Musk is posting that tweet in response to the request to essentially the call from the United Nations to donate some more money to solve the food shortage problem in Africa and in some developing countries. And I think basically he is saying is that look, I have money for better use. And I keep in mind that Elon Musk, in addition to running the Tesla company, he's also running a huge company on X-Space, and he is noted for having the ambition of establishing a permanent human base on Mars. He's been touting this idea that human beings should be more than just a single planet species. It should be multiple planet species. So this is a really, really, pompous and lofty ambition. And I think he's posting this in this, it reminds me of a very famous verse in the Bible, in Proverbs, basically talking about, soaring eagles nesting among stars. I think that's the vision that Elon Musk has in mind, and he wants to realize this vision within his lifetime. And he's basically saying that, look, I have other things to do, I have other things for my money to do, and that, this is a human cause. It is doing something good for the entire human race, that we should, making ourselves a multi-planet species. And I think that's what he's really talking about here.
Professor Mahoney, your guess, before quoting the Chinese poem, Mr. Musk also wrote the word humankind. I mean, what's your take on this cryptic introduction?
Hegel, when he observed Napoleon, he described him somewhat famously or infamously as the world spirit on horseback. And I think, in Musk's case, he tries to portray himself as an eccentric everyman. He's projected as potentially being the first, becoming at some point the first trillionaire in human history. It's clear that he's discussed a lot about being concerned about Earth, but also dreams of leaving it. This past week we had COP26. He's involved in green industry, but at the same time, if you follow him, because he is a bit of a cipher, right, of the zeitgeist. He's had some personal problems in his domestic affairs with his partner. He's moving his company from California to Texas because he doesn't like government in California. He's got a big business interest in China, and the decoupling and the tech regs are all causing some issues. So I think all of these things, all the frictions that we're seeing right now, perhaps in his personal life, in his businesses, and in global affairs, and the still rising problems of emissions, I would suggest that all of these issues, this is what we should interpret, right, and as being underlying his usage of this
That's
quote.
all the time we have for now. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We appreciate you joining us. And that does it for this edition of Dialogue Weekend. Thank you for watching. Bye for now.